Imagine applying for a building permit, but before the project can move forward, you're told you'll need to consult with the elves. That's not the setup for a fantasy urban design novel, but a real headline from the New York Times in 2005. Building in Iceland? Better clear it with the elves first. The article recounts case after case in Iceland where road crews were diverted, bulldozers mysteriously malfunctioned, or construction projects stalled because locals insisted that the land belonged to Iceland's hidden people, or the Huldufolk. It's exactly the sort of paradox that foreign journalists apparently love. The New York Times breathlessly frames it as proof that a modern secularized nation remains stubbornly superstitious. But what often goes unsaid is just how much this fascination has been constructed from the outside. As scholars of religion have pointed out, the international obsession with Icelandic elves is a surprisingly recent phenomenon. 19th and early 20th century travel writers barely mention elves at all. Only in the late 20th century did guidebooks, travelogues, and documentaries turn elf belief into a pillar of Iceland's tourism brand, ranging from in-flight magazines directing tourists to elf dwellings to German television dramas about murdered elf commissioners. And yes, that's actually a thing. The German drama, not the elf commissioner. So what's really going on here? Are we looking at the survival of authentic pre-Christian beliefs and practices, or a carefully curated tourist elf, satisfying foreign journalists and tourists looking for Nordic mystique? To keep our analysis manageable, I'll be focusing specifically on belief in elves and hidden people, or in Icelandic, álfar and huldufólk, which are most often used interchangeably both in folklore and in the scholarly literature. Now, the term álfar, where we get the English word elves, was far less precise than modern readers might expect. Rather than referring to a single race of beings, as we might imagine from The Lord of the Rings, álfar in medieval texts seem to have been a broad label for a variety of supernatural figures. When we turn to the medieval sources, especially the collection of Old Norse mythological and heroic poems called the Poetic Edda, elves seem less like hidden neighbors in the hills and more like divine figures. In the Eddic poems, the álfar occasionally appear alongside the Aesir in stock formulas, which refers to the primary group of Norse gods. One common example is the Aesir and the Elves, which turns up again and again as a stock phrase in multiple poems. Folklore scholar Dr. Terry Gunnell argues that this positioning suggests that, at least for some poets, elves were imagined as beings of comparable stature or importance to the gods. He says at this early point they seem to have been some kind of godlike being. Other scholars argue that the term at times seems to overlap with the Vanir, one of the two main groups of Norse gods. For example, consider Lokasenna, one of the mythological poems of the Poetic Edda. It describes a great feast where all the gods have gathered, and basically all of the gods are present, including figures we usually classify as Vanir. In the opening lines of the poem, the assembled company is described with that familiar formula, the Aesir and the Elves. But here's the problem. No elf actually appears in the story. The only groups present are the Aesir and the Vanir, but since the poem never uses the word Vanir, some scholars think that the álfar may simply be a stand-in for the Vanir in this context. Still, Dr. Gunnell stresses that the picture is inconsistent. Elsewhere, the elves are listed as their own category alongside both the Aesir and the Vanir. And in another poem, the word elf refers to the character Völundr, the son of a king. In this case, the term seems to refer to a kind of dangerous supernatural otherness, and not necessarily godly powers or stature. The elves may have also been thought of as noble male ancestors, a status you gained after death. The term itself is a grammatically male word, and sagas about kings remember certain rulers who, after death, were revered under the title of elf. You also see this in Old English names like Alfred or Alfric, where elf was used as a mark of nobility or possibly even otherworldly status. Evidence from Icelandic sagas indicate that elves also received blood sacrifices, which some scholars have interpreted as some form of ancestor worship. So according to the scholar Arman Jakobsen, in these earlier sources, elf should be thought of as a broad concept and hardly a category. The word can encompass almost any supernatural being with powers greater than humans, while still remaining distinct from the main pantheon of the Aesir. We should not be surprised by this fluidity, though. Scholars in recent years have argued that each Eddic poem may reflect a different worldview, and forcing them into a single Norse cosmology risks oversimplifying pre-Christian Norse religion. It makes more sense to think of shifting plural belief systems rather than one coherent system. Just as we should not assume that the authors of Mark and Matthew held identical views of Jesus, we should not assume that every Old Norse poet imagined the álfar in the same way. Whatever else they were, though, at least in the Eddic poems, they were beings of godlike stature, important enough to be named in the same breath as the gods themselves, hang out with the gods at a banquet, and receive blood sacrifices. By the later Middle Ages, though, we start to see elves take a very different shape. Folklore scholar Terry Gunnell points out in his research that saga sources from the 13th and 14th centuries show a gradual shift as the Alvar were increasingly equated with the land spirits, or rock dwellers, who were thought to live in the landscape. They also start to pick up the mischievous, folkloric vibe we see in later history. Beings that can slip through walls, kidnap kids, or lure men and women into temptation. Gunnell argues that these motifs are likely influenced by a wave of Romance literature coming in from France. In other words, they begin to look less like minor gods and more like the fairy folk of later European tradition, uncanny spirits that intrude on everyday life. And this shift was not unique to Iceland. In Old English, the cognate word elf was already showing up in compound words that tied elves to natural features. Hill elves, water elves, wood elves. The word even crept into medical vocabulary. Elf sickness was a way to explain mysterious aches or sudden illnesses, and across Northern Europe, elves were increasingly linked to folklore about enchantment, disease, and the lurking dangers of the wild. By this stage, they were not receiving sacrifices anymore as in pre-Christian Iceland, but instead they were turning up in charms, healing spells, and cautionary tales. So we see an evolution in the concept of elves, slowly merging into the wider category of nature spirits. This laid the groundwork for a concept we see in modern Icelandic folklore. Elf dwellings, usually a rock or a grassy hill where elves are believed to live. Disturbing them is said to invite trouble, sickness, accidents, or broken machinery. So in this case, elves become less like gods and more like ambiguous neighbors, hidden but always bound to the landscape. Out of the sense of the landscape itself being alive with unseen powers grew the idea of the hidden people. While they're most famously linked with Iceland today, stories about hidden people are actually a pan-Scandinavian and even pan-Germanic belief. They appear in folk tales from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and northern Germany, and most of them actually reflect a wider attempt by Christians to explain how beings like elves and trolls fit into a wider Christian worldview. Many of these folk tales root the hidden people in the biblical myth of Adam and Eve. One common story says that when God asked Eve to show him her children, she hid some of them out of shame because she was embarrassed by how many kids she had. In response, God declared that those concealed children would remain hidden forever, becoming the unseen people who dwell in hills and rocks. Other variants of the story tie the hidden people to the cosmic struggle between God and the devil. The spirits who refused to take sides in the war in heaven fell to earth, neither damned nor saved, and took up residence in the landscape. They are not quite angels and not quite demons, but something else, something in between. So these origin stories show how Christians attempted to negotiate between pre-Christian traditions and Christian theology. Instead of erasing older nature spirits or calling them demons, they placed them in an ambiguous category. They might bless a farmstead, borrow household tools without asking, or teach songs at a waterfall, but they might also lure kids away, bring illness, or curse those who disrespect their dwellings. In 19th and early 20th century folklore, before the influence of internationalized pop culture, the hidden people were imagined as a kind of parallel society. They farmed, kept their livestock, and even went to church on Sundays, but they did so in an invisible world layered onto the human one. And in terms of appearance, they were not tiny Tinkerbells or majestic Legolas figures, but ordinary human-like beings living their lives in the natural landscape. Most tales from this period describe them as looking just like people, their otherworldliness revealed only by where and when they appeared. You might realize after the fact that a mysterious stranger you passed on the road was, in fact, a hidden person. For the most part, Icelandic folklore did not draw sharp lines between elves and the hidden folk. The terms were basically interchangeably used to describe this parallel unseen society living alongside humans. Though also in the 19th century we see a rise in folklorists beginning to describe different beings as different species. Elves versus trolls versus ghosts. The scholar Armand Jacobsen says that this was influenced by the rise of scientists creating a taxonomy of species, and folklorists wanted to get in on the taxonomic action. And eventually the medieval Álfar were reimagined as a specific category of being. And here we can see the groundwork being laid for Tolkien's elves in The Lord of the Rings. While the elves are quite ambiguous in Old Norse literature, Tolkien presents them as a clearly defined race, a humanoid species or people complete with their own languages, histories, and cultural traditions. Tolkien himself was pushing back against what he considered to be the degradation of elves in popular imagination. By his own time, elf often brought to mind the image of a tiny, whimsical sprite, kind of like Tinkerbell. His creation of an elevated, almost angelic race was a conscious attempt to restore what he saw as the true mythological aura of the elf. Remember, in the Poetic Edda, they often appear to be godlike, though his elves owe more to the taxonomy-driven mindset of 19th and early 20th century scholarship than to the fluid category of pre-Christian and medieval Icelandic thought. And here we finally arrive at the tourist elf of today. By the early 20th century, elves started to shift once again, this time not so much inside Iceland, but in how outsiders talked about them. The religious studies scholar Matthias Eggeler has shown that tourists gradually became fascinated with Icelandic elves, trolls, and other beings over the course of the 20th century. Earlier travelers hardly mentioned them at all. The German tourist Bernard Calle, for example, writing in the late 1800s, devoted just a single sentence to elves in his travel book, calling them a defunct superstition of the past. Fast forward to the 21st century and the picture looks very different. Folklore about elves is now front and center in travel writing about Iceland. For example, check out the author Sarah Moss, who wrote a memoir about a year she spent living in Reykjavik. She devotes 2 of her 16 chapters entirely to elves and folklore. The German writer Tina Bauer lived in Iceland for 2 years, and she wove frequent references to elves and hidden people into her memoir. As Dr. Eggeler Riley points out, both writers barely touch Iceland's actual state church, Lutheran Protestantism. Meanwhile, the picturesque imagery of local Icelandic beliefs in elves, trolls, and similar supernatural beings has taken a prominent place. It was during this time that elves were also being reimagined through the lens of the New Age movement, giving rise to Icelandic mediums and seers who claimed to communicate directly with them. The most famous of these was Erla Stefansdóttir, often described as Iceland's best-known elf specialist. She published books about elves, and most famously, a series of maps marking out elf dwellings. Translated into multiple languages and sold to tourists, these maps are still part of Iceland's tourist marketing today. She was also a member of the Icelandic branch of the Theosophical Society, a movement founded in the late 1800s that blended Western esotericism with Hindu and Buddhist ideas, and later became a key source and inspiration for the New Age movement. Through that connection, she reframed elves as part of a wider spiritual ecology, spirits tied to invisible energies and the sanctity of the natural world. In a sense, she acted as a kind of spiritual entrepreneur, mediating between folk tradition, global New Age ideas, and the tourist economy. Her illustrations of elves are also revealing, showing influence from Victorian fairy painting and pop culture like Lord of the Rings and Disney. And scholars argue that this pop culture imagery has started to loop back into Iceland itself. People increasingly imagine the hidden people not as invisible farmers living parallel lives in the hills and rocks, but as characters that look suspiciously like Legolas or Tinkerbell. Dr. Armand Jakobsen even draws a sharp line between what he calls the traditional Icelandic elf and the tourist elf, a hybrid figure born out of folklore, global pop culture, the New Age, and the demands of the tourism industry. But how do Icelanders today think about these beings? To get a clearer picture, we can turn to a series of national surveys that have tracked supernatural belief in Iceland over the past 50 years. The conversation exploded on the international stage after the publication of a survey in 1974. The survey found nearly half of respondents considered the existence of hidden people or elves as either probable or certain, at 24% respectively. Another 40% said it's at least possible. A few decades later, the University of Iceland supported a new batch of surveys conducted in 2006 and 2007 that aimed to follow up on this 1974 study. These new surveys asked many of the same questions on a wide variety of supernatural or paranormal beliefs, not just about elves, but also about belief in ghosts, astral projection, and guardian angels. The 2006 surveys found that these numbers had dropped dramatically, with only 9% saying that they were certain that elves or hidden people exist, and 18% calling them probable. Meanwhile, the share of respondents who considered their existence unlikely or impossible rose sharply, 24% and 15% respectively. The share who answered possible, however, declined only slightly, remaining relatively high at 35%. As I've said in a previous video though, international media coverage really loves to focus in on that middle category, that it's possible that elves or hidden people exist. This figure often gets lumped in with the probable and certain categories to produce a more dramatic sounding headline. More than half of Icelanders believe in elves, though this obscures what the numbers actually show. Not strong conviction, but a persistent reluctance to dismiss the possibility entirely. Finally, Dr. Terry Gunnell spearheaded a new survey in 2023, which shows a continued erosion in belief. Compared to the 1970s, when nearly half of respondents said elves were either probable or certain, only about 20% fall in those categories today, 12% probable and just over 8% as certain. Meanwhile, outright disbelief has climbed steadily. About 27% now say the existence of elves is impossible, and another 28% say it's unlikely. Perhaps most revealing is the shrinking middle ground. The possible category has slipped from around 40% in 1974 to around 25% in 2023. So where does this leave us today? On the one hand, the surveys are clear. The number of Icelanders who say the existence of elves or hidden people is certain or even probable has dropped steadily since the 1970s. Outright disbelief is higher than ever, but belief has not disappeared. What these raw numbers don't capture, though, is the texture of how Icelanders themselves navigate the question. A few years ago, I released a video about religion in Iceland, and several Icelanders in the Religion for Breakfast audience shared their own stories. One said their grandmother not only believed in the hidden people, but regularly interacted with them, though they emphasized she never thought of them as elves in the tourist sense. Another compared it to leaving cookies out for Santa even after you've stopped believing. You do it not because you're convinced Santa exists, but because it's part of the cultural fabric. Others admitted they don't believe at all, and some even found the international obsession with elves to be annoying, a stereotype blown out of proportion by guidebooks and tourism marketing. And yet, even skeptics said there's still a lingering respect. I was really intrigued by this viewer who said they are agnostic and yet reluctant to denounce beliefs my grandparents held in the hidden people. So while the media sometimes treats Iceland as a curiosity, a tiny secular nation that somehow still clings to these superstitions, there's actually a much wider range of responses than what a chart of numbers can illustrate, ranging from fading certainty to lingering respect and cultural identity. The real myth in the colloquial sense of a falsehood is the idea that modern societies ever fully left the supernatural behind. In his book, The Myth of Disenchantment, the scholar Jason Josephson Storm demonstrates how paranormal and supernatural beliefs continue at high rates all around the world, even in stereotypically secularized nations, whether we're talking about ghosts, horoscopes, spirits, angels, or demons. My hunch is that outlets like the New York Times latch onto elves as a puff piece topic precisely because the other-than-human being in question are elves. For Western audiences, angels and demons feel too familiar or too Christian to attract much attention. The elf, by contrast, conjures up images from pop culture, making for quirkier headlines. But as the anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann reminds us, all of these figures belong to the broader category of invisible others, beings that people imagine, narrate, and sometimes even claim to experience as part of their own world. The quirky headlines about elves tell us more about the media than it does about Icelanders, which is why I like using Ground News, a news comparison website and app that helps you cut through that spin by showing how different outlets cover the same story across the political spectrum. So, for example, check out this story on Ground News about President Trump recently suggesting that using Tylenol during pregnancy might cause autism, despite a major 2024 study debunking this claim. Here we can see Ground News has aggregated literally hundreds of outlets covering this story. Scroll down and we can see the majority of these sources are coming from centrist outlets, followed by left-leaning outlets and then right-leaning outlets. Scroll down again and you can see their factuality chart, which shows the vast majority of these sources are rated as highly factual. And finally, here is the ownership chart. The largest chunk of these outlets are owned by media conglomerates, followed by wealthy private owners and then corporations. Ground News also enables you to compare the headlines to see how each side frames the story. The right-leaning Washington Examiner ran with this headline: Trump bashes establishment medical orgs on autism Tylenol link, framing the story as an ongoing battle with elites and institutions. While the left-leaning MSNBC wrote, Trump without new evidence tries to link Tylenol and autism. Here the emphasis is on Trump's absence of evidence. Ground News lets you see these perspectives side by side, helping you to see the broader view of the media landscape. Ground News also has a feature that I use all the time called the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are heavily covered on one side of the political spectrum, but almost completely ignored on the other. So instead of living in a news bubble, you can see what conversations you might be missing altogether. If you'd like to give it a try, Ground News is giving viewers 40% off their Vantage plan. Go to ground.news/religion for breakfast or click the link in the description below, and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.